Good morning, JScamp. How's everyone today? No, that doesn't cut it. That doesn't cut it. We got to be much more awake than that. How's everybody doing today? That's much better. Thank you very much. I am thrilled to be back here. This is my second year here at JScamp. And thank you very much to David Pick and the people at Hack Collab and the other people that have put on this conference. It's fantastic. I love the city of Barcelona, so I've enjoyed being back here this week. Before I get started with my talk, I just wanted to give one quick announcement. For those of you that have followed some of the things that I do, you may be aware that I've written a series of books called You Don't Know JS. And these books are getting a little bit old, and so I'm officially announcing for the first time that work has now begun on the second edition of those books with the expected publish date of the beginning of next year. So if you've been reading those books and been wondering when are we going to get updates to it, that's finally happening. And that's thanks to the sponsorship of the second edition from Front-End Masters, which in my opinion is the premier platform for video training courses. All of my courses are there, a bunch of other great software trainers, their courses are on there as well. So check out Front-End Masters, check out those courses, and be looking for the second edition of You Don't Know JS coming soon. Okay, with that out of the way, I'd like to jump in and share some thoughts with you this morning. And I want to talk to you about death. Well, that's kind of a very almost bad topic, and that was really janky. I'm sorry that that jumped around like that. That's not a great topic to start off a conference with, is it? I don't have any political statements to say about taxes, but I want to talk about death, and specifically the death of ideas, but not just ideas that die. I want to talk about ideas that die and then are reborn as better ideas. And so that's still jumping around a lot. It was a little bit better. Let me fix that for the rest of these slides. Sorry, hold on just a moment. We're going to turn off disable progressive rendering, refresh the page. Okay, that was a little bit better, a little bit less janky. All right, so actually, there's one other thing. Let's change dark mode. I don't like that. All right, that's much better. That'll be much better on our eyes. Okay, so the death of ideas, or rather really the change of ideas. Heraclitus said that all ideas, that's the constant. The only constant is that things are going to change. So ideas are going to change. And there are some great, fantastic ideas that have been part of the very foundation of what we call the web. But it doesn't mean that those ideas have to stay the same. Sometimes those ideas can change, and sometimes newer and better ideas can be born from that evolution. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. And I want to make this perfectly clear. I am not qualified to talk about this topic. Most of you come to hear me talk about JavaScript specifically, and while the JavaScript will be touched on in this talk is about the greater topic of our web, the web that has given me a career and given so many thousands, millions of other people a career, and I care so deeply about the future of the web, not the future for the next 2 or 3 or 5 years or 10 years, but 20 years and 30 years and 50 years from now. I want my kids and my grandkids and my great-grandkids to be experiencing the amazingness of the web. And I don't want it to go away, and there are some things that I think are challenging our web, and we're far too comfortable with the way we've been building the web. So these are some ideas that I hope will kind of shake some things up, and I may upset a few of you when I talk to you about progressive enhancement. But let's dive in. I want to start briefly by looking at where all good stories start, which is in the beginning. In the beginning of the web, we had pages like this, and a group of folks got together just recently and rebuilt the very first web browser. This was what the web looked like on the very first web browser. And it didn't take long before other web browsers came up as well. So then we had web browsers like this, where we got to start to see the web in its most primitive and basic of forms, but all of the basic building blocks were starting to be there. We had things like links, where you could link and connect from one page to another page. So the first web built from Tim Berners-Lee in 1991, and a few short years later, we started to be able to see websites. And I remember this is when I was becoming a programmer, is when the web was starting to launch into the world. And I don't think anybody could have believed at that time how transformative the web would have been. But that transformation to me speaks to a tremendous responsibility that I think all of us as builders of the web have. And we maybe don't always pay that much attention to that responsibility. HTML was not enough, so we started adding more things to the web. We wanted images and colors. And then, of course, we wanted movement, so we added the marquee element. And, of course, we wanted lots and lots of spinners and construction signs. And the best of all, we wanted those trailing mouse cursors. And I can imagine what Tim Berners-Lee was thinking of the web as we perverted it with all of these amazing things. But that's how the web began to move forward, is that we just had this explosion of creativity. What can we do, and how can we express ourselves on the web, and how can we allow other people to express themselves on the web? It was fantastic. Now I'm going to turn off the motion here, and I'm going to turn off progressive loading of those images because we don't need all of that stuff. Let's get back to the simple slides that will make this story make a little bit more sense. Okay, so as the web began to mature, we realized that we needed to change how we built things. We needed to change how we built because the early web looked a lot like this. And it's kind of funny because the web is starting to look a little bit more like that now. But the early web looked a lot like this, where everything was together, the styling, the code, the HTML, it was all in one single file. And then we started doing this thing called separation of concerns. We split the web out into these different layers. We said the markup can live separately from the styling in the style sheets, and then the styling can live separately from the code. And we literally had separate files and separate file formats, and entire build processes built around this idea that we keep these concerns separate. There's been a lot of rethinking of the idea of separation of concerns over the last few years, where concerns maybe weren't about the technology and they were maybe more about components. I'm not going to go too much more into that thought process, but we're sort of shifting on a 90-degree axis the way we think about concerns. But I want to talk to you about why this was transformative and important for the web, but also potentially where it set us on the wrong track. Because this separation of concerns led to the idea that what we could do was build the web in this one way. The first strategy that we had was just build it so that if you had the ability to see something in its perfect form, then you could see it. But if you didn't have a capable enough device or a capable enough browser, what it would fall back to, what we called graceful degradation, it would fall back to something that was still functional. And this was one of the first strategies for how we could build the web, was use graceful degradation. Always think about what would it look like if somebody was using a less powerful device? How would they still be able to interact? Could they still do anything useful and meaningful? And the spirit behind graceful degradation is absolutely important. But maybe the approach that we went about it wasn't so great. And by the way, graceful degradation, one of the most common metaphors for this was the escalator. Mitch Hedberg, the famous comedian, he said, I like an escalator because an escalator can never break and it can only become stairs. And this was the idea here, right? Because we have this great website, but it can never break. It can just simply degrade itself gracefully to something. Now, I want to provide a slightly more context. This is the fuller part of his comedy bit. This is the fuller quote. And I want you to notice the second part of this, because he said, you should never see an escalator temporarily out of order sign, just escalator temporary stairs. Sorry for the convenience. That's a funny bit, and we latched onto that, and we started saying, see, escalators are just like how we ought to build the web. You can probably guess where I'm going with this, because all metaphors are terrible. And I actually saw this, a photo that I actually literally took. I was in Las Vegas a few weeks ago, and I saw all over the place escalators that were broken with out-of-service signs in front of them. So maybe that wasn't the greatest way for us to build the web. And a few years later, we developed a different strategy for how to build the web. And we called it progressive enhancement. Now, this wasn't really actually a totally different technological approach than graceful degradation. It was really a change in mindset. Instead of starting with the perfect thing that we want and then allowing things to be taken off, stripped off when the device couldn't support it, then we said, let's start with this basic thing that focuses on the content, and then we'll add stuff on top of it to make it better and better and better. The idea was like the birthday cake. You start with the cake, and then you add some more layers onto the cake, and then you add the icing and the candles, and things just get better and better. But even if you didn't have those things, you still have cake. That was the metaphor, and that was the idea. So progressive enhancement was actually launched at South by Southwest in 2013, and this is one of the slides from that presentation. And I highlight this particular one because if you were to go through and look, and I encourage you to go check this presentation out. It's only 16 slides or something, but if you look at this, there's a whole bunch of essentially technological hacks that are being detailed and documented here. And the state of the art in progressive enhancement at the time was to talk about how many different ways could we hack the device to behave the way that we needed it to, so that everything just looked and worked magically correct for everyone. And the claim was that progressive enhancement, by relying upon all these technological things, that we were focused on the content, and this felt so morally right and morally superior. But the truth is, the focus was on the technology. What was being left out, and what we told ourselves, is that we did all of this and it would be better for the users. But I'm not convinced that we as an industry really actually asked that question correctly. So as the web got more and more popular and more of these techniques took hold, what rose was, we need to make this fast. We need to make it efficient for it to load on all these different devices. And so a whole field, web performance optimization, rose up. And one of the most common early of those claims, this was the Why-Slow list. If any of you remember back in the day, Why-Slow had all these great recommendations for how to speed up, how to performance optimize your page. And one of the most important of those techniques, kind of the original, the OG of those techniques, was pipeline your resources. Here we're building the web in these layers, so why don't we actually deliver the web in layers? Why don't we deliver it as an HTML layer, and then later the CSS can load in, and then later still than that, the JavaScript can load in, and why don't we even lazily load all kinds of other resources? And by the way, I bit completely into this. And I even created projects. One of the ones I was most well known for early on in my career was Lab.js. It was a script loader that was all about deferring the loading of things and pipelining resources, because it was all about how quickly can we get the page to start to show something. But it began to expose this problem that's called FOUC. And no, that does not stand for flash of uncolored character. It stands for flash of unstyled content. The idea that somebody might see some content in some uglier form, and then a split second later it might flash into the more stylized form. And as soon as we began to pipeline all these resources and do all of this dynamic loading for web performance reasons, we started realizing actually the experience of that is terrible. People don't want that. So we began to develop all these techniques to make FOUC go away, to hide the FOUC. Still performantly load these sites, but try to hide the FOUC. Hide this flash of unstyled content. And by the way, you may think, well, that's an old school term. Nobody uses that anymore. Just recently, I saw these two pop up in a blog post. FOIT and FOUC. One is like flash of invisible text, and one is flash of unstyled text. This is still a problem today because of our obsession with web fonts. What happens when you have some text, but the font hasn't loaded yet? Do you show them any text? Do you show them text in a base font and then switch to the new font? There's all kinds of techniques, and they're adding things to CSS to allow you to control the behavior of this stuff. And that's what that blog post is about, is the things being added to CSS, this font display property. But I think maybe worst of all is a term that I coined back in, 2012 or 2010, something like that. It's called FOUC. Don't bother Googling for it, because nobody was paying attention to me back then. They're not really anymore today, but that's all right. But FOUC stands for flash of unbehaviored content. And what I love about this, it's the idea that this content is here and I can see it and it's even styled, but I can't click on the damn button because nothing has loaded in the JavaScript layer yet. Anybody experience that, where you've been on a web page and it's not really fully functional yet? I can see something, but I can't actually make any usage of it yet. Or worse of all, I click on the thing because I think it's going to pop up like a calendar widget, and it just takes me to an entirely different page, and I lost all the data that I was typing into the form or something like that. What I love about FOUC is that it's really been putting the FU back into the web for a good decade now. But these are all things that cropped out of our thought process that said, let's build the web in layers, let's deliver it progressively in layers, because that's morally right. We call this progressive enhancement. And then let's not worry so much about all these potential user experience flaws that may happen. We'll figure out more and more hacks on top of it. And anytime you see somebody build some hacks and then have to build more hacks to cover up the original hacks and more hacks to cover those up, we should have taken a step back and said, I'm not sure if we're on the right track. Webpagetest.org, by the way, the de facto standard. If you want to care about the performance of your site, you should totally check out this utility. This website can allow you to test the performance of your page in real-world conditions all around the world. And one of their great features that I love is this film strip view, where you can start to load a website, and it shows you in like quarter-second or half-second or full-second increments, what does your site look like in some random device in some random part of the world. And you'll notice on this particular website, this was like the Chase Bank website, you'll notice that it took like a full 2 seconds before anything other than a blank white page showed up. And this is that dreaded idea that you have this blank thing that the users are just going to so much hate and they're going to bounce off of your website. I've heard all the statistics just like you have, that if you can make things show up faster, then users are going to spend more on your website. Get those pixels on the screen as soon as possible, because then they will feel like things are fast. Even if they have to deal with all those FUs, it's okay, because they'll feel good and they'll spend money on your website. Except, I'm not really sure if they actually like that behavior, and this is ironic given that I'm showing one of the worst offenders for creating problems with performance would be all these social buttons. I know the stats are there, but I'm not convinced that this thinking led us to really conclude that users like what they're doing. They may feel enough confidence, and they may just, on base human instinct of their impatience, they may be willing to spend more money on your site because your site loaded faster, but they may not actually like the experience that they had doing so. So is it really true that we like this kind of web experience? This is what I think of with modern frameworks, and I know it's not particularly fair for me to say, but essentially it feels like modern frameworks are making it easier and easier to put more spinners on the page. And this is not a made-up screenshot, by the way. This is literally how that Chase website looks when you load it from a fresh browser cache. It literally looks exactly like that, with all these spinners on the page. And my wonder is, are real users saying, wow, this web is so great, it just loads so many incremental updates, and I just love it? I don't think that's true. Has that ever led to a happier web experience? Do we really like these placeholders? There are websites out there that will display like the gray bars where the text hasn't loaded yet. How many of you love to see those placeholders for text instead of the real text that you want to read? Because at least we don't want the layout jumping around. Placeholders and spinners are a covering up. They're a hack for user experience purposes to cover up some of these original sins that I think we did when we divided up the layers of the web incorrectly. And I think if we're being honest, at best, users are tolerating this experience. They're not loving this experience. So the first big idea, the first big revelation that I want to share with you today is that the great lie is that it was morally superior to deliver the web in these technological layers, to progressively deliver the web. This is a lie because it was based upon us saying what we would like as developers instead of really asking what is the end user going to like, especially when that end user is not in our fast corporate internet broadband experience with these high-end MacBook Pros. This is a perpetual problem that we have so much of these blinders on where we're saying, I know what the web is supposed to be because this is how I want to experience it. And that doesn't at all map to what people are experiencing. A non-technologist user never thinks, oh, cool, I see some content. This is awesome. It looks so pretty. And now it's fancy and interactive. They don't think that at all. You know what they think? My God, why doesn't this website ever let me do anything? That's what they're thinking. Why does it take so long for stuff to happen? We actually, ironically, are making it more obvious that things take longer to load. More obvious that we're now downloading megabytes worth of JavaScript instead of a few K worth of JavaScript. Imagine for a moment, because I know all of you have experienced this, you've watched a video on a web page, and at some point or another, the video goes weird. It gets all pixelated and stuff because your bandwidth drops out, and then it comes back. And I want you to imagine that as a developer, what you're thinking is, wow, this is really cool that they came up with this technology to figure out in the player what the bandwidth was and adapt the frame rate and all. And you're thinking as a technologist, and a user's like, why is it that my ISP can't give me nice, clean, clear video? Because they're not thinking as a technologist. To a non-technology user, that same experience is the worst possible experience for them. And yet we herald it and we champion it and we hand out web awards to say, look how amazing you are for inventing these techniques. And have we ever stopped to ask a real non-technologist end user, do you like that experience? Is that the web that you want to have? The ultimate conceit of Snow White and the mirror on the wall, the ultimate conceit is when the queen asks the mirror, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? Guess who she sees looking back at her? It's herself. And when developers say, what do the users of the web want? And they look in a mirror, guess what they see looking back at them? They see developers. Do we ever get outside of the mirror? Do we ever get outside of our own comfort zone and really start to ask ourselves, What does the end user want? Some of you know Ethan Marcotte. He goes by Beep on Twitter, and he created this technique. He's done a lot of great things in his career, but notably, he created this technique that we now call responsive design. And we've all done this before. We've all built a website with all the like CSS breakpoints and responsive stuff, and then we've dragged the browser a window around and seen how cool it is for everything to like flow and change and move around and hide and show and stuff like that. And the truth of the matter is, never once in the history of the web has any user, non-technologist user, ever done that. They do not drag the window around and they're like, oh, look how cool this is when I drag the window really small that it's like a menu. They don't do that. You know, at best, a user has seen your website on a phone and a tablet and a desktop, and at best they're actually annoyed that on the phone a bunch of stuff is hidden and harder to get to. They've noticed that you have a different design on the phone, and yes, you built it once and it just nice and clean, all the same HTML and CSS just nicely transformed itself for the phone screen. And yes, it looks nice on the phone, but for them, if they've experienced it in the more full form on their iPad or on their desktop, they're annoyed at the fact that things are so much smaller and compact on the phone. The point that I want to make is that these strategies are not bad, but these strategies are saying that we want for a single build of this technology to work in all these users and all these different devices, and that is a developer-centric focus. It's not a user-centric focus. We tell ourselves bedtime stories like, oh, this is better for the user. Now, I do not mean to say that progressive enhancement, responsive design, the people that have done this, Ethan and Zeldman and all the others that are out there, they are thought leaders of our industry. And I do not mean to say that they did something wrong for our industry because they were moving a worse idea forward with these ideas. What I mean to say today is not that these ideas were wrong, but that their time has come for us to move on, to evolve, and to move to a better way of thinking. It's not that these are not about the user, because they sort of are, but it's kind of more indirect. It's a little bit more murky. The worst thing, though, is that these lies end up dividing our community. The greater web development community is perpetually divided over some of these same concepts. Because there's one faction of our community, maybe the old schoolers, and I would certainly consider myself to be an old schooler of the web. There's one faction of our community that considers themselves to be like HTML first and then CSS, and maybe JavaScript is sort of optional. It's a nice to have, if you will, on top. They're very much diehard progressive enhancement. And then there's another side of our community that's been JavaScript first for their entire career, and they barely tolerate things like HTML as long as they can put them in their JavaScript and call it JSX, and they barely tolerate things like CSS as long as they can make it look like a JSON object in their JavaScript file. They don't like those technologies, they like JavaScript, and this is creating a huge divide. Chris Coyer called it out in this blog post, and I think you should go and read this blog post because it's pretty well done on the topic, although I have to be honest that Chris is part of that former group and maybe has a few blind spots to some of the frustrations from the other side. For example, some of those blind spots, these are actual things I pulled up when I was trying to see, because these are things that I've read and I've said, man, that's really frustrating to see people from that part of the community, and I'm from the JavaScript part of the community, and that from somewhere else in the community, they say something like, JavaScript is just a last resort. It's like the worst of all the possible conditions. If you can't possibly figure out any other way to do it, well, I guess you can use JavaScript. And I've made a career out of JavaScript, and I love JavaScript, and I believe JavaScript is transformative. I believe it's part of the DNA of the web. Now, that's not to say that if HTML and CSS can do something, like if you can render a form element or do something in that way, that's not to say that it's wrong to ever do that, but to suggest that you should never, ever, under any circumstances, use JavaScript for that just because it could be done with HTML, that's also myopic, and it's also ignorant, because it turns out JavaScript has a lot to say about accessibility. There's going to be a talk tomorrow morning about accessibility in JavaScript, and it turns out when you really study the technology, JavaScript has a vital role to play there. So I don't like this message that keeps coming from that side of the aisle that keeps saying, oh, no, JavaScript, it's this bad thing, we should get rid of it. Another example, this one, Eric Meyer, who I have a lot of respect for, and he's one of the grandfathers of what we've done here in the web industry, but he said, cosign with added expletives of exasperation. If you can't develop for the actual web, find a platform that suits you better. And he was responding to this idea that anybody on the web would think that maybe there's a JavaScript-only experience that is okay to build. And he said a JavaScript-only experience is not the actual web. This just drips with condescension. This is part of what's creating this divide. And maybe worst of all is the responses that people have to JavaScript, and certainly there's been a lot of abuses of JavaScript in the ad industry, for example, but there's a response to the problems of the bloat and overloading of JavaScript and the performance issues that it creates, and one of those responses, and they're seriously considering just literally capping the file size of a JavaScript file. That means right in the middle of your JavaScript file, it might just cut off because it might say there's been too many bytes loaded. Guess what that's going to do for the experience of the user on that website? It's not going to make things graceful for them, I can assure you. These are frustrated responses on their side, and I get why they're frustrated, because far too many JavaScript developers have looked down their noses on HTML and CSS and said they're not real programming languages. And if you are die-hard HTML or die-hard CSS and you're an expert in those technologies, and by the way, they do require expertise. They are fantastically complex, just like JavaScript. If you're one of those and you hear some JavaScript developer talking down, it's going to make you feel defensive. So I get where this feeling comes from, because I felt the same thing when they say those things about the technology that I love. This is not healthy for us to keep dividing ourselves among these layers and saying, well, one technology is better, one technology is more meritorious or more morally superior to another technology. And by the way, there's plenty of blame to go on both sides, and I am not the first person to suggest that progressive enhancement might be dead. Tom Dale, way back in 2013, wrote this article. Tom Dale, you may know, he's one of the co-maintainers of the Ember library. And he wrote this article, and essentially his claim is, there is no such thing as a non-JavaScript web anymore. JavaScript is a de facto standard on the web. It's de facto that every site is going to need JavaScript. And so this idea of trying to build the web where JavaScript might not be present is outdated and antiquated. That's essentially his argument. And it actually builds itself on this idea because progressive enhancement said that JavaScript was optional. And he said, no, JavaScript's not optional anymore. Therefore, all of progressive enhancement is completely invalid. You see, while I understand what he's saying, that's a terrible, weak argument. That's a ridiculously weak argument to say that because there are some sites on the web for whom JavaScript is no longer optional, the entirety of progressive enhancement is dead. That's ridiculous. So these sorts of arguments that are made myopically, they're made from this very small and biased view of the web. They are not helping things. They are dividing our community. It's almost a religion at this point, and no wonder it's hard for us to have productive and reasonable conversations about these topics. And by the way, on that topic for just a moment, diving in on is no JavaScript even a relevant use case today? The problem is that all of the discussion that centers around technology, around devices, around what things you want to build, around whether or not your boss or your client will let you have the time to do those things, those are all completely missing the point. The only question that matters here on is no JavaScript a relevant use case is, does the app and the experience that you're trying to build have a non-JavaScript version or not? There are things that you build, for example, a first-person shooter in 3D rendered 60 frames a second. It's hard to imagine that without some sort of code running it. It's hard to imagine that with purely HTML forms. Right? So if that's the experience that you're building, of course no JavaScript is a relevant use case for you. But there are other experiences where things are in the middle, or there's other places where there's a clear win. There's a clear non-JavaScript version of it. And maybe it still makes sense to do that. And you may think, oh, that's totally out of line. Let's talk about something like a mapping application. And we call it an application. We call something like Google Maps an application. And if you've ever looked at the code, it is amazing how complex the code is in the Google Maps API. All the stuff that they're able to build. And you may think there's no possible way that the web could ever sustain or that users could ever possibly make use of a web where we didn't have these fancy interactive zoom and pan interactive maps. It's an application. There's no non-JavaScript version of that. And that's only because you haven't been around long enough to remember that for many, many years we had mapping applications that had essentially no JavaScript in them at all. Now, if you were to bust out MapQuest today on your phone or on your desktop and try to get directions to the local bar, your friends would probably make fun of you because this is very old school, right? Like, people are not going to be thinking, oh, yeah, I should definitely go and load up my MapQuest. They're going to load up something like Google Maps. But the point I want to make is that this, for many, many years, this was a perfectly valid way for us to figure out where we were going. And yes, you did literally just click on those like blue arrows on either side of the 4 cardinal directions of the map, and a whole page refresh came back with a new set of map tiles displayed. And it's amazing, but many, many millions of people were able to make use of mapping applications like that. So it turns out that even something that might look like there's no possible way to do a non-JavaScript version of it could have a fallback. It could have some non-JavaScript version of it. And that's the question you really should be asking yourself. It's not really about the technology, it's about the experience that you want to deliver. Is there any reasonable non-JavaScript experience to be delivered? But again, this entire discussion, even in my talk so far, this entire discussion is all about the technology. It's missing out on the most important part. Who's experiencing the web? So Alex Russell is at Google, one of the big names. Many of you probably know and follow Alex Russell. And he tweeted this out several months back, and I thought it was particularly appropriate for what I'm talking about. Strongly suspect that if you got up on stage and asserted, we're here to make users' lives better and should therefore demonstrate our technology choices first do no harm, at a front-end conference, you'd start a brawl. I have news for you, Alex. Here I am at a front-end conference saying we should be making users' lives better and we should demonstrate that our technology choices don't do any harm. I hope that we don't start any brawls as a result of me saying that. But as Alex admonishes, shouldn't we turn our attention to the user? Isn't the user the most important part of this equation? Can we fight for the user? And I don't mean just like in words and we nod at it and then we go away and then we forget about it. I mean really, really fight for the user. Could we do that? I've been using a term for many years, sort of almost as like a superset of the ideas around responsive design. This term I've been calling adaptive design or adaptation of design. Because it's really not just about what can their device do, like what screen size do they have, but there's an awful lot of conditions that we might want to adapt the user experience on their page to allow the user to have something better as a result. We might want to adapt to the lighting conditions. We might want to adapt to the bandwidth conditions on their site. And in many ways, some of the progressive web apps and service workers are just starting to give us the ability to adapt to those kinds of conditions. So I've been calling this adaptive design as sort of a superset of responsive web design. But I've been getting it wrong because the problem with adaptation, the real problem with thinking about this as adaptation, is that adaptation is like accidental survival. I mean, if you think about it in the evolutionary sense. It's really more about automation than it is about intention. We're basically saying, let's build an app out of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and then build some other technologies around it. And let's hope that maybe accidentally that app somehow adapts itself to the user's experience, the experience that they're hoping to get out of the web. There isn't an intentionality of design there. And my question to you is, what if we didn't have to guess what the user wanted? What if we didn't have to guess what they needed at any given moment? What if it wasn't a guess? What if there was, I don't know, some way for them to tell us? How many of you have ever read any part of the HTML specification? Anyone? Okay, we're at a web conference and I'm seeing way less than a third of those hands going up. Okay? Go Google it. Go read parts of our specification. If you know JavaScript, you should be reading part of the JavaScript specification. These are the founding documents of our industry. It's important that we know what is supposed to be our guiding light. And in the HTML specification, section 3.2 is called the priority of constituencies, and it says this: in case of conflict, consider users over authors, over implementers, over specifiers, over theoretical purity, and so on. In other words, when there's a competing set of constituencies, when there's a competing set of concerns, who gets first priority? The founding document of our industry says the user is supposed to get priority. How often do we flip this backwards, though? How often do we prioritize convenience for the developer over what the web gives? And by the way, I've heard this argument many, many times. Developers will tell me, well, if we make it really great and awesome for a developer to build something, then they'll build really great user experiences. There's essentially a theory about this in the economic span. It's called trickle-down economics. If we give the rich people even more money, it'll trickle down to all the rest of us. And guess what? It didn't work. And it doesn't work for user experience either. I didn't mean to make a political statement. Don't clap for that. I'm not here to make political statements, but trickle-down user experience doesn't work. You don't just make things better for developers and magically that makes things better for users. As a matter of fact, sometimes when you prioritize developers, users get the short end of the stick far too often. You all have heard the term user agent. That's the kind of technical term that is used for browsers, that the user agent. The problem I have with agent is it sort of implies this like somebody sitting in between me and the experience that I want to have. Agents, they represent you, they negotiate for you, they prepare all the paperwork for you, and they act as your go-between, right? So we treat the browser as this like proxy in between us and the web experience. What I wish UA stood for is user advocate. Because advocates don't sit in between. Advocates are cheering for me. They're trying to empower me. They're trying to help me get the most out of my experience. Why isn't the browser my advocate instead of my agent? Why is it sitting between me and making all these decisions for me? And why are developers making all these decisions for me about what experience they think I want to have out of the web? So what if we just asked them? Now, I know that sounds like configuration, and I know configuration sounds like a dirty word. So many developers have gotten on board with this whole like convention over configuration, and we want the devices to figure these things out. We don't want the users to have to figure this out. And I'll be completely honest with you. I am not saying that users should go into like Chrome flags and twiddle around with their configurations. No regular non-technical user has ever done that or ever will do that, okay? That's complete non-reality. But it is possible for us to ask users, what would you like out of this experience? Imagine, for example, if we designed a car the way we design the web today. The car had a radio, but it had no dial, no buttons. It preset what it thought you wanted to listen to based upon the time of day and the weather conditions and what you were listening to on your phone. And let's say that it also doesn't have any air conditioner controls or any of that stuff. It'll set all the environmental controls because it knows the perfect temperature for you. And if you need to turn off the radio, you can definitely pull the car over to the side of the road, and you can like go into the trunk and unplug or push a button or something. But nobody wants to do that. Just let it figure it out for you. That's what we're doing on the web. We're saying actually what the user's preferences are doesn't really matter. That's a power user at best that might have some sort of preference about what experience they're getting. What I'm getting at here is that if we take the intersection, if we take the marriage of product design, UI design, and UX design, user interface and user experience. If we took the marriage of all of those three things, what I'm claiming is that they really are, and here I'm launching a new term, okay? Get ready, I'm launching a new term because they really are imprintable design. That, I think, embodies what I've been trying to say for many, many years is the next version of what we ought to be doing. Instead of responsive design, it's imprintable design. And here's your hashtag, okay? Imprintable design. As in, the user imprints themselves onto the experience. They're part of the experience instead of a bystander to the experience that somebody else figured out for them. So progressive enhancement, while great in spirit, focused most on the developers and the technology. And what I'm getting at is that instead we need to focus on each person, not a person in some abstract sense, but each individual person that is using our experience. Here's one of those tweet quotes. You're going to want to send this out as a tweet. There's human beings on the other side of those pixels. And there's your hashtag again if you want to put that in a tweet. There really is human beings on the other side of these pixels. And we don't think about that very much. We think about these very abstract terms. There's a flaw in our thinking that has led to this great lie. One of the flaws in our thinking is that we've been designing for consistency. When you think about the web, the way that it's being experienced today, there's 7.6 billion people on the planet. Who knows how many billions of devices there are and how many more billions of devices there will be invented just next year. So many different devices, so many different people, so many different scenarios. If we really cared about making things best for them, consistency is the worst possible thing that we could be trying to go for. Because there's no possible way that you can design one web experience that is optimal for all those billions of devices and billions of users and the multiplication of those. Billions times billions. There's no possible way that one experience could do that. And I love what this tweet said. This was Zeldman, and he was quoting somebody else at a conference. I think it was the an event apart, one of the event apart conferences, web conferences, and he said, not identical, not pixel perfect. As web designers and developers, our aim is to ensure that no matter how a user chooses to explore our sites, the content is perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. The artist in all of us, whether you're an artist, whether you're a designer or not, the artist in all of us, it strokes our pride whenever we can see an experience and have it look exactly the same, pixel perfect, in some other website. But the truth is, no non-technical user in the history of the web has ever pulled up your site and pulled out a little measure and said, oh, that one's 1 pixel lower on this browser than that one. I'm going away. They bounce off your website. That's never happened. Ever in the history of the web. No non-technical user has ever bounced away from your application because, oh, you use the native form elements and it looks slightly different on iOS versus Android or Chrome versus Firefox. That's never happened. And we get so up in arms about, as a designer, I can't make it look exactly the same, so I have to do all of these hacks. And we're putting all of that attention and energy into the wrong thing because we're focused on consistency. We ought to be embracing divergence. That's what the web is all about, is divergence, not convergence. Another flaw is that if the device can do it, the user wants it. We built our entire technology stack on this idea that we want to do maximalism. We feature test to see if your phone supports WebGL. And if your phone supports Retina images, and if it supports all these fancy web fonts. And if your phone does support those things, well, then certainly you must want them. Here's a real scenario, not a made-up scenario, a real scenario. Because I'm a T-Mobile user back in the United States, and I get great internet over there. But when I travel abroad, I get free internet, but it's at 2G speeds. Guess what it's like to experience the web of today in 2019 at 2G speeds? It's pretty terrible. We've been failing at this pretty badly. And I have this app, for example, that does bus routes. And in the US, because my phone is capable of doing all this fancy WebGL rendering, when I pull up a bus route, it renders the whole bus route for me in 3D, right? So I can like literally fly through where my bus route is going to go in between buildings and see the view and all that stuff. It's so cool and so awesome, right? But same person, me, I get on a plane and I fly over here to Europe somewhere. So now I'm not on a great bandwidth connection. Now I'm on really slow connection. I might even be having to pay for it depending on if I'm in some really strange roaming area. I might have to be paying for metered bandwidth. And let's say that it's 11:30 at night and it's raining. And I know that the last bus is just about to arrive and my battery is at 3%. And I want to figure out the bus route to get back to my hotel in this strange European city. I am your same customer with the same device, but is my experience, is my desired experience going to be the same? Do I want your 3D rendered WebGL experience? No, I just want the simple quick list of where's my bus route, where's my bus stop. Just because the user's device can do it does not mean that the user wants it. We have to stop prioritizing what the device or the developer thinks and start prioritizing what the person using it might really want. That's what the next generation of us designing for the web has to entail. And by the way, when I say who's using your site here, I don't mean in like some abstract sense, like for your startup pitch deck or whatever. I don't mean like who's my user. I mean who's literally using your website. And we have really terrible ways of answering that. We pull up Google Analytics. And we're like, well, this is who's using my website. I can see the cross-section of people that are using iOS with this particular Safari version. And I can see that they don't have accessibility tools enabled. And that's who my user is. That's such nonsense. Mark Twain said that there are three kinds of lies. There are lies, damned lies, and statistics. Statistics are the average that is then back-applied, pre-applied back to an individual person. We should not be surprised that when we take those statistics and then start applying those to individual user experiences, that a whole lot of users get marginalized and left out. And the common thread in all of these thoughts so far is that we think that we know better than they do what experience they want. We think that. We think we know, we live, eat, and breathe the web, so we must know this better than they do. And I don't think that's true. I'm not convinced that we know better than them. We think and we assume, but these average generalities do not apply to individual users. Let me give you another thing that I'm inventing here today. E12Y. You've heard of A11Y, accessibility. E12Y is empowerability. That is a much higher bar, because if you think about accessibility, and I may ruffle some feathers here, because I know and I believe deeply that the web is inherently a platform that can embrace accessibility. We far too often get it wrong. It's been said that the web is accessible by default and then we break it, right? So I believe that deeply, but accessibility is such a low bar, because if you think about it in the basest sense, accessibility is like, can we get just barely more than completely broken for them? Can we just make it just so that they just don't have just the worst possible experience, but just one tick higher? It's such a low bar when we think about it in terms of what people's disabilities are, instead of thinking about what their abilities are and how we can empower them to do more with our web experience. So this higher bar that I'm setting, not that accessibility is wrong, but a superset of that is to talk about how do we build experiences that empower those 7.6 billion people on the web, that empower them to have the best possible experience, the best possible expression of themselves on the web. There's your hashtags again, okay? So we've been talking this entire time about the user, but I have to nitpick on that phrase for just a moment. User is the most common term that we refer to as the individual that is sitting there with their device. But the problem with the term user is it implies this very narrow utility purpose, that our relationship to them is primarily based on what they can do with our product. That's our relationship to them. Customer is even worse. It's gross, because it means our primary relationship is really just their monetary value to the company. I think it truly could be said, they're not using our site, we're using them. Customer is totally the wrong way to think about that person that's sitting on the device. How about we just call them a person? They're a real human individual. How do we call them a person? Because that means we recognize and we celebrate their autonomy, their agency, their individuality, and their merit. That's the kind of web experience that we ought to be building. And it goes from the simple text all the way up to the complex mapping applications and the 3D first-person shooters. It's people who use those things, and it's people who we should be focused on. Another one of the flaws that's gotten us off track is that the browser knows best. If it's not the developer knows best, we believe the browser knows best. And browser makers, by the way, believe this. Browser makers believe that they know better than even the developer does what experience that user really wants. People can't be trusted. The only one who knows what the person wants and needs at that exact moment, in the most complete sense, is that person. Let's talk about some of the things that the browser or the device could know better than the person. For example, the CPU and the memory that is currently available in the device. Does the device and the browser know that better than the user? Yep. It knows that better. What about whether power is going to be unlimited? I mean, we might know the current battery level, but we don't know the conditions about whether that user is in a particular location where they're going to be able to plug in and recharge soon. Or maybe they're in a location where they're not going to be able to recharge for 48 more hours. We don't know that. Guess who does? The user. So the device is not in the best position to determine whether we have unlimited power. And by the way, we completely take this for granted. I have been to a small rural village in the middle of Botswana, Africa. This is an actual true story. This was more than a decade ago, but I went there to this small rural village. 70,000 people living in this general area. 10, 15 people living in a hut the size, not much bigger than where I've been walking around this morning. And in the middle of this village, there's a single light pole with a single electrical cord coming from some other remote village over to this village. And there are hundreds of cell phones hanging off of this light pole, recharging because it takes more than 24 hours to recharge their device, and it costs an entire day's salary to do so. We completely take for granted that power is an unlimited free resource. And there are many, many people in the world for whom that is not true. So we just freely use up all that battery power, and we don't care about it. But we should be asking the user, are you okay with the power usage that's happening? Are you okay with the fact that I might zap up some? Are you going to be able to recharge? Is it going to cost you a lot to do so? Here's another question. Is the data unlimited? Well, we could know something a little bit about their bandwidth, and maybe we could guess something about their ISP, but we do not know whether or not they're having to pay for this bandwidth. The only person who knows what this is going to affect on their monthly bill is the user. It's the person. What about whether or not their hands are usable? This is something a lot of people don't think about. But if you have if you have an abled person who has usage of both of their hands, and they are your person that is your user or your customer, and then they break their arm, and now they only have the usage of one arm for a prolonged period of time, weeks or months, and maybe they also have a baby, so they're holding a baby in the other hand, and now they don't have the usage of either one of their hands. They're still your same customer, they're still your same user, but now maybe their hands aren't quite as usable in their particular environment, in their particular situation. The only person who knows that is the person using the device. We don't even stop to ask them that. We all long since feature detected that you have this fancy touchscreen device, so we're just going to show you all the fancy touchscreen stuff. And finally, what about lighting conditions? Another often overlooked thing. Yes, the device might be able to guess a little bit about ambient lighting conditions, but how many of you have ever been out in the bright sun and you literally can't even use your device? I had a scenario where I had an Uber driver that could not find me, and I was trying to text him in the app, and it was so bright outside I couldn't even see the Uber app to give him the text, and I totally missed the ride. I had to go back inside and recall another Uber because it was just so bright in that particular location that I was in, I couldn't even interact with the Uber app to text my driver to tell him I'm over on this street instead of that street. The only person that knows the lighting conditions is the person. So can we just ask them? I know that sounds like such a novel idea, but can we just ask them? This is not unprecedented, by the way. Pick your font size is a feature that many websites have. A lot of you have probably used websites like this and maybe not even recognized this, because a lot of times this is thought about as purely for accessibility reasons, but I want to suggest that it's more than that. These little selectors on websites that allow you to select the font size that you want to be displayed for that particular page. It's not just that one website. I found hundreds of examples of websites out there that have these little selectors. This is the New York Times. You just click and toggle and it increases the font size. And by the way, this is not just some niche idea. This is actually a recommended standard by W3C. They recommend that websites should give the users the choice over what font size they want to experience. Well, if we could imagine asking a user, hey, under the particular conditions that you're in right now, which font size works best for you? What I'm suggesting is maybe we could ask them other things as well. Here's another example. Any of you ever used Gmail in a desktop browser? Have you ever noticed that little link down at the bottom for load basic HTML? Have you ever clicked on it? It loads up a perfectly functional version of Gmail that doesn't really use any JavaScript at all. It's all HTML. And yes, it's so terrible that you click on an email and a page refreshes with your email. It's not fancy like their fancy JavaScript client, but it's perfectly functional, and it uses way less bandwidth. I use this all the time when I'm traveling on these really terrible 2G speeds. I'm so thankful that Google, even in 2019, has prioritized maintaining essentially a separate version of their email client. I don't know how they built this, but I wonder if this is an entirely different code base that they have to keep maintaining. And they've done it because they know it's important for people. Sometimes people want a lesser than the best possible on their device experience because their conditions are different. Maybe that's what the user wants. Maybe that's what the person needs. And by the way, if Google can do it with their Gmail, then they should have done it with their maps, right? They should just buy MapQuest and make MapQuest the offline or the non-JavaScript, the non-fancy version of Google Maps. Another flaw here is that people always want the most powerful experience. If we think the devices want the experience, that's a flaw, but also thinking that the user wants the most powerful experience, that's also a flaw. I love this example. Some of you know that there's like 1 billion people in India that use, almost all of them use the Opera Mini browser. None of them are using these fancy, smartphones that we're using. Most of them are using this much more restricted experience for the web. And some of the big sites ship very specific purpose-built versions of the application. For example, Facebook. So those people are, if you're exploring the web in something like Opera Mini, you're getting an entirely different Facebook experience. It's not just the Facebook site with responsive CSS that hid a bunch of stuff. It's a purpose-built application. As a matter of fact, Opera worked with them to build this very specific version of this app. And millions, almost 1 billion people have been using this app. I don't know exactly how old this story is, but my friend Bruce Lawson, who used to work for Opera, he told me this story about how at one point they decided that they had upgraded Opera Mini's technology, and they upgraded the Facebook app to give it more features. And one day they flipped the switch, and they turn it on, and now like nearly 1 billion people have this more fancy, more powerful version of Facebook. And guess what happened? Thousands, millions of people started complaining, saying, bring back my simple, fast Facebook. Wait a minute, your device and your browser can now do it. You must want it, right? And it turns out users don't always want that. Sometimes they prioritize other things. So, I think we need a new term. Not that the spirit of progressive enhancement was wrong, but we need a new term to move on. PE. Let's stick with acronyms because people don't like to redo acronyms. So it could have been progressive experience. That's part of the way there. It could have been personalized experience. That's a little bit better. But I'm going to give you, I think, what's the best PE of all. People empathy. Boiling this down, that's what I'm suggesting is let's move from focusing on technology to focusing on people. So how do we begin practicing that people empathy through what I've called imprintable design? These are some very incomplete thoughts. This is not the only way to do it. But I don't want to just sit here and trash on all the things we've been doing and then not give you any ideas on what we might be doing better. Here are some ideas. I think that people must be given more control over their web experiences. If you're looking for a moral imperative in the web, it's this one. People have to be given more control. It's not about the device. It's not about the developer. It's about the person. As builders of the web, we have this profound responsibility to live up to that moral imperative. That's our guiding light, and yet we've been forgetting it for so many years, and it's our chance to turn back and say, you're right, people are at the center of everything we do, first above everything else. So I think of it this way. I think that regular, basic, non-technical users, those who have never opened up developer tools, they have no idea what Chrome flags are, I think that they understand experiences on their devices, and especially on the web, in terms of a couple of basic, what I'll call currencies. One of those currencies is speed. That is to say that I think general users, even non-technical, can perceive the difference between I was using this thing and my device was pretty fast, and then I used this other thing and now everything's slower. They have a general perception about the differences, the relative delta differences in speed. We're not talking about they know anything about megahertz of their processor. That's not what I'm talking about. But they do understand relative differences in speed. That's a currency that they care about. And when I mean currency, I mean they're willing to sometimes spend some of that speed. In other words, they're willing to tolerate something a little bit slower in some circumstances, not all circumstances. That's a currency that they understand and that they're willing to expend. Another currency is battery level. What they understand in a very general sense is, my battery level's high, I open up your website, all of a sudden my battery level's much lower, right? I don't care where all of that battery power went. I don't care that it was for WebGL or some background, processing or gradients or border radius. I don't care where it went. I just know that my battery gets much lower, much quicker when your website is open. And there are a number of websites that I have on my fast modern devices that zap up my battery power, and anytime that I'm traveling or I'm going to be away from a plug for a while, I close those out. Because I know if I just leave them even open in a background tab, which they're not supposed to not be doing anything, even in a background tab, they're just going to zap my battery power. I won't name and shame some of those websites, but you all use them as well, and you know what I'm talking about. So general non-technical users can understand that their battery is draining much more quickly. And also, a real currency, they can understand that they get a higher monthly bill or they have to pay to recharge their data plan much more quickly when they use certain websites than when they use others. You know, Chrome, I think, supports like turning off all data for the entire browser, but you don't have any control per tab. There's no way for you to tell this tab, I have all the data that I need, I want you to just not use any more data, but I'm going to keep loading data over here in this tab. There's no way to tell them that. And I've asked Google developers, why don't you allow me to control that per tab? And they just sort of shrug it off like, nobody really cares. I have news for you. Users really care because there are billions of people in this world for whom bandwidth is not free and unlimited. They absolutely care. And if you gave them the opportunity, I mean, we give them the opportunity to mute individual tabs, but we don't give them the ability to control the data in individual tabs? It's ridiculous. These are currencies that people understand. You don't have to be technical to understand that these things are happening on your device. And so what I think is that the person and the browser working in unison can decide how much of each of those currencies they want to spend at any given moment. That's what I think is the core, is empowering them to decide those things, and not through the use of some fancy developer tools or Chrome flags. I envision it literally as simple as like a slider that you pull down over the address bar. And that slider defaults all the way to the right-hand side where this is the maximal experience, the way the web is currently built. But a user might say, you know what, right now I'd like to drag it down a little bit because I'm willing to tolerate a slightly less fancy experience because I don't want to spend so much on those currencies right now. And that information is critical because that information can then be sent to the server to tell the server what kind of experience the user wants. That is not a complicated experience for the user to drag a slider and say, I want more experience, more fast, more fancy, or let me drag it all the way over here because I'm about out of battery and I just need the text for the bus route. We can boil down some very complicated things into things that even the most non-technical of users can still understand and allow those people to express those ideas to us. So what I envision is that the dragging of that slider would essentially go into an algorithm and there'd be something like request fidelity as a header that is sent to the server. And it's maybe on a scale of 0 to 1. It's calculated in a very opaque way. The user doesn't know what that means, but it's calculated in an opaque way based upon not only what the person has expressed, but what the browser knows about things. They know about CPU and memory and other things like that. So they send this calculation to the server, and then the server decides whether they're going to do something with that information. And this is really critical because for us to begin building the web based upon what users want, we have to be willing to respond to what they're asking for. This can't be like the do not track header where we basically add a feature to the standard and then we all ignore it. This has to be something that we take seriously. And yes, when I see this request fidelity and it's down at like 0.3, that means the user, the person, they don't want all the bells and whistles. Let me figure out some lower layer to send them. And it could be as simple as configuring, instead of layers of technology, degrees of fidelity, we could configure this like we configure responsive breakpoints. You could have a configuration file somewhere in your app stack that said, if the fidelity is from this number to this number, serve this set of templates with this set of components, with this set of style sheets, with this set of code. And if it's here, then pick this feature and don't pick this feature. We could set these things up and we could say, you know what, for my website, doesn't matter what they send, it's always the same basic experience. And for another website, we have 2 breakpoints or 3 or 5 or 10. We could begin to deliver the web in layers, but not layers of technology, rather layers of experience that the user, that the person has expressed a preference for. Those sorts of decisions, we could decide to send or to skip sending WebGL, animations, fonts, retina images, etc. But even more importantly than that, we could send or skip entire features of the application. Don't send the stock ticker when they've asked for a 0.3 fidelity, because they probably aren't worried about live stock updates right now. And we can even alter the behavior of this is what I was getting at when I was talking about the adaptive stuff earlier. We could alter the behavior of our server based upon their requested fidelity. For example, we could batch up the requests. Maybe they're willing to tolerate that they don't get an immediate update when they click something, that it's going to batch up several requests and do them all together. And maybe they're willing to switch off the SPA mode, right? Maybe they're willing to tolerate a brand new page load instead of everything fancy loading. We can respond to these sorts of preferences by changing the behavior of the app as they go, not just once at the beginning of their experience, but as the experience unfolds. Maybe the browser is seeing that the battery is getting really low, and so it begins to send a lower request fidelity header so that you start to respond to that and say, okay, well, we'll switch off some of those things and offload them more to the server. Maybe you could even treat it like an offline app when the request fidelity gets below a certain level, and try not to load anything over the data bandwidth and try to do everything from the cached information that you have. These are all things that we could be doing if we just responded and cared what the person wanted. And most importantly of all, that the browser, as user advocate, is going to have to veto whenever the inevitable happens, which is a server ignores that information. It has to veto those things by cutting off large resources, refusing to load things, refusing to even request things that are way beyond what the person really wants. So that's a very lightly filled in skeletal framework of what I think in printable design could be. To start asking the user in a very simple and non-technical way, asking the person, what would you like out of your experience at this moment? And then begin to change the way that we build the web. To build it instead of in terms of layers, instead of in terms of components, build it in terms of layers of experience, what the user wants. So you're inevitably going to be wondering then, well, what does he think our first steps are going to be? What should we do? Because that feature doesn't yet exist in a browser, so do we just have to wait around for the browser standards to do it? Should we wait on the browsers to adopt this stuff before we even start thinking about it? And let me give you a resounding no. The fact of the matter is the browsers are not going to build any of what I just told you. Not anytime soon. They're not going to build it until we've already established a precedent that we as developers care to ask the user for their input. We're going to have to do this wholesale across the entire web without the benefit of these nice fancy sliders. We're going to have to do things like the load basic HTML links and the font size selectors and 100 other things exactly like that. We're going to have to start proving that asking the person what they want is an important part of what the web's DNA should be, and then browsers are going to respond and make that better. They're not going to build this until we have taken the first steps. I know for a fact because for 3 or 4 years, I've been trying to talk to browser developers and ask them to do exactly this idea, and they've just been shrugging it off. They're not going to listen until we do it. They're not going to listen until we take the first step. Now, there are going to be a multitude of objections that are in your mind right now. Objections like, my boss won't ever approve this. My clients will never give me the budget to do this stuff. It's too much work. It's going to be so much harder. And by the way, on that last one, I actually think this is going to be less work. I think it's going to be less work to build the web this way than what we have been doing. But it's going to be hard to believe that until you start trying. You're not going to believe me just because I say it, but I really genuinely believe a web that's built in terms of layering itself on user experience is an easier to build and easier to maintain web as well. But my simple answer, and this is going to feel way too callous and off the cuff for you, so I apologize in advance, but my simple answer to all of those objections is don't ask permission. Just build things in the better way. It is not up to your manager or your client. They don't understand, so they shouldn't get a say-so. They really shouldn't. Build it and prove first that it's better, and they'll follow along. Did you ask for permission to add Babel or Webpack to your technical stack? Did you ask for permission to switch everybody over to VS Code? Did you ask for permission to do any of the things that we developers care about? Of course you didn't. You just did it because it made things better for you. What I'm now saying is go do what's better for the person. Don't ask permission first. Do what's better for the person, and everybody else will catch up. You don't need permission to make the web better. If you need permission, let me give it to you. You have permission. Please go make the web better. In conclusion, I'm going to leave you with this thought. There was an article several years back. It's been often cited, so this is how I found this article. An article several years back that talked about progressive enhancement and why it's so good, and talks about some of its moral superiority and things like that. But it ends its case for progressive enhancement. It is a pro-progressive enhancement article, and it ends its case with this quote. It says, "No one has disproved the benefits of progressive enhancement or proposed a better technique." Have I? Thanks very much for listening. I appreciate your time.